When I was younger, I wrote and illustrated my own stories for fun. Throughout grade school and high school, I realized I wanted to pursue those artistic desires in a career. Art classes at the local performing arts center and in school developed my work into something I was eager to present in college, where I began to approach my art with an interest in the individual. Connections through personal portraits allow the viewer to learn more about the subject and experience a moment of the subject's perspective. I love to make portraits. My studies were infrequent through high school, but became a daily occurrence in college. I feel a close connection to personal individuals and wanted to push that desire. This illustration, a piece much larger than something I've done before, came from a push to work in bolder color palettes and different ages and backgrounds than myself. I also wanted to work in portraits that emphasized line work and expressive shading techniques outside of neatly blended gradients. Each year, I follow a prompt that challenges artists to only use ink for 30 days of art, this piece being one of the results. Working in heavy detail is actually a lot of fun for me. I get lost in the repetitive process and certainly got lost doing this bust. Often I get same-face syndrome, where I continue illustrating identical types of portraits over and over again. I wanted to work against that problem and use my love for fine line work in this subject with a new face. I also learned that artists produce their most interesting work typically when they're bored. I got tired of drawing portraits and wanted a slight twist on the media I typically use, so the nearest unique supply in my studio happened to be yarn. After some preliminary sketches to map out shading and highlights in her facial features, I placed smaller traces of thread down first on the desk. This lined up where I'd put the lighter and darker parts of the portrait, and so she came to be and lived right there in my studio for over a year. Later, when the COVID pandemic hit, I again felt pushed to create art with a deeper meaning than just my drive to draw individuals. I wanted to illustrate those on the front lines who were essential during a time when it was recommended to remain alone rather than reaching out to other people. I contacted various healthcare workers and created this illustration of my dad, who is a clinical engineer. As quarantine dragged on, I looked for connections. If I couldn't hang out with friends in person, maybe drawing them would give me hope of all the people I can see when the pandemic is over. Creating those personal connections didn't have to come from in-person interactions. As I gathered inspiration over time at home, I focused on the concept of planar structure. This idea maps out highlights and shadows in my subjects, seen in a current favorite artist of mine, Jennifer Hayashi. She overlays photographic images with Posca sections to diagram different portions of her subjects. I love her bright color mapping technique and embodied this idea in my recent portraits. I have a passion for bright, colorful illustrations and expressive character design. I want to encourage imagination during all walks of life, bring light to a distressing world, and examine ways in which the art of illustration can alleviate that distress. I want a career as an illustrator. An illustrator is required to master the elements of character development, textual and visual connections, design and layout that entertain, and enlighten and excite the reader. All of these elements were pioneered by fine artists whose goals were to make cultural values physically present. The arts expand our understanding of the good, the true, and in short, what's beautiful. What I love in the pursuit of illustration is that I can imagine everyday life through an aesthetic lens. So how does the art of illustration intersect and diverge the world of fine art? The absolute creative freedom of fine artists expands creative possibilities, while the range of images gets channeled between the covers of my books. But there's a caveat. The absolute creativity of the art world for mere shock value values artsiness rather than connecting to viewers. Were we taught to appreciate the aesthetic view, superficial beauty, merely looking good, more than the artistic one, calling attention to something significant that the viewer may have missed? Artists can communicate without words. As John Berger notes in Ways of Seeing, a child looks and recognizes before it can speak. God commissions us to create, but it's more than mere aesthetic beauty. Visual communication sparks our emotions and our mind. Creating connections or oppositions is aesthetic art at its best. As a child, I thought drawing hyper-realistic was considered the best art. The more detail you'd add, the better. Fortunately, I was wrong. The art world grows and expands every day in variety with gorgeous pieces. Artists' roles within society, and what I've chosen to do, feel that we've been called into a role of creativity, pushing expression and meaning into our work no matter the political stance or personal affairs. Art is involved with the rest of society. We are with society in their own artistic perspectives, not outside of them. My work proceeds from influences in the discourse of illustration and children's literature. I stumbled upon the children's literature course taught here by Dr. Bill Borman Cornell. He realized I attended for the book illustrations and writing rather than how to teach in a formal classroom setting. I was the only non-education major in that class, and the professor, now my graphic novel collaborator, was quick to notice. Our collaborative work began back in April 2020, creating a graphic novel together. After all those years I spent doodling and writing my own short stories came to fruition. When I began making the novel, I was not familiar with many comic artists or how panel styles worked. I caught up on some techniques comics artists typically use for their layouts, and through Dr. BC, I've been researching lots of different authors and illustrators, which is basically just reading a lot of graphic novels for fun. This book directly addresses the need for imagination, time away from screens, and daydreaming. These activities promote expressive thoughts, encouraging creativity and finding ideas outside of the physical space. When I began illustrating our novel, I wasn't giving characters the personality that they deserved. I was focusing on finishing as many page spreads as fast as possible without catering to each individual human or alien creature we'd created. This pushed my work to develop their personalities into styles I previously enjoyed from other graphic novel artists. Illustrator Ryan Andrews explores the relationship between fantasy and reality while visualizing sometimes difficult topics, such as learning to love someone you sometimes can't stand to spend time with. Illustration is often collaborative, with writers and illustrators working in tandem to create imaginative worlds. Artist Tilly Walden uses chunks of flat color with even-weighted, expressive line work and a muted color palette. Not only do I love the illustrations, but the magical stories are exciting to get lost in. As I began to illustrate my character portraits in a small study, I showed off their colors and overall cheerful personalities from the individuals and the book itself. Now, Gracia is our introductory character, and she is fully human. Eager to end the boring days of sitting on the couch doing homework, she's transported to their otherworldly universe to explore imagination and create her own world. The first creature we meet after Gracia gets transported is Electrolux. He's from the Department of Earth Studies and specializes in welcoming humans into the world of imagination and encouraging creativity. Now, Hoover's a big guy, so I want to emphasize his jolly spirit, multiple arms, and large torso. I physically cut his arms out of the frame and illustrated on black paper to make Hoover jump out. Our flamingo with braids, Kirby, tends to fade into the background sometimes, but has a cheerful spirit. The light colors on white paper add to the bright character dynamic, and the cutout braids bring her energetic behavior to life. Bissell is a sophisticated, human-like individual with salamander features. She presents grace, authority, and knowledge with a hint of fashion. Unlike the other illustrations, I chose to cut out a section that stems from her sweater design off the page. My practice indicates an interest in the imaginative roles of society, how viewers alongside myself may engage in the art world without feeling swallowed whole by over-theorized perspectives few outside the practice would comprehend. Working with art should not diminish our perception. Rather, it should encourage us to transform our ideas into new opportunities of appreciating the past, brightening the present, and looking towards the future.